That's all I got? One goddamn 50s maze card?
Don't worry, nobody's listening anyway.
Welcome back to Cards and Comics, and I hope you enjoyed the intro. And today, yes, we are going to be talking about Willie Mays cards. One of my favorite topics to talk about because I love Willie Mays cards. And we are going to specifically talk about the price gain or loss on Willie Mays cards from 2021 to 2022. So this is a year-over-year review of card values. Now, I did have to limit my research to make it reasonable to put a video together like this. So I'm only going to look at PSA cards because the volume in those cards and those holders are so much higher than SGC. And I'm only going to look at 3 different grades: PSA 6, PSA 7, PSA 8. Because that has the most volume in most of the cards I'm going to look at. Also, you know, anything above a PSA 8 is just a wild card in terms of sales. You know, it's kind of a unicorn for a lot of cards. And the half grades don't sell enough to really have enough data on. Because over the history of the half grade, they are given out about 1/10 the amount of time as the whole grade. And so there's just not enough data there to really make any sort of strong, reasonable statistical analysis. Alright, so let's get started here by looking at this giant spreadsheet I put together. And again, you see PSA 6, 7, and 8. Values from the first column will be 2021, the second column is 2022, and then I calculate the difference and the percent change. And on the right side, I highlight the years where all 3 grades went up in value or stayed the same. And then on the left side, I'm highlighting cards where sometimes there wasn't a lot of sales or there wasn't a sale in March. So I had to look at February or January for a sale. So you know, all data sets aren't perfect. You have to kind of make some inferences. And so, you know, I'm trying to do the best, you know, with the data I have. And you can't make data up. You just have to take what you got. So we'll go into and we'll do a high-level summary. You can kind of see some numbers here. But I'll do some summary and I'll try to interpret the data a little bit and give you a summary of what I think all this means. So, first of all, high level, that if you were to buy every Willie Mays cards, and also I did include All-Star cards for a very specific reason because I've noticed All-Star cards really gaining in popularity and value. I'll talk about it, and I think also there probably needs to be a little bit more work done on understanding that. But first of all, if you were to buy every Willie Mays base card, an All-Star card in a PSA 6, PSA 7, or PSA 8 grade, if you'd bought them in 2021, right now you would have made $10,000 on the PSA 6s. You'd have lost $60,000 on the 7, and you would have gained $43,000 in the PSA 8. Now that doesn't really make sense to a lot of people, but what it does make sense in terms of how people look at cards and how people actually buy cards, this kind of makes sense, and I'll get into it a little later on why the 7 I think is kind of an in-between grade, and I'll kind of go into why I think that. But I do think the 7 is kind of sticking out there for a reason, and I do have some speculation and some thoughts on that. But this is the straight number, so I'm not making anything up. This is what it is. You'd have made money on 6 and 8s, you'd have lost money on 7s. Now, if you look at overall growth, it's very interesting that the 6 and the 8 grew at exactly the same amount, whereas the 7, even though in total dollar change was negative, the percent growth, if you take all the cards together, still grew 7%. And overall, Mays cards grew 18% in all 3 grades. So again, you made about 18% return on investment if you had 6, 7, or 8 on average. So this is, to me, pretty good. Now, 6s and 8s definitely grew a little bit stronger, But it does show that during this great correction in the hobby, maze cards continue to grow. So that's high level, and I think that's what we all thought. Now, sometimes we're thinking like, man, these cards are still doubling in price. Well, that's not really true. Even at the highest level of growth, we didn't see that quadrupling of prices like we saw in 2020 and in some parts in 2019, right? So let's look at biggest winners, right? So this is what I talk about, the quadrupling of value here. So the top $5 increases. So again, this is going to be cards worth a lot of money already, right? Like the 52 tops, the 51 Bowman rookie card, the 58. Now I'm looking at all three grades here. So you see an 8, a 6, an 8, a 6, and an 8. 1, 7, and the 53 is a 7. Now 53 is on here twice, and there's a good reason for that when we look at pop reports in a minute. But obviously the top dollar increases went with cards that were hard to get, and so that made sense that these cards are hard to get. They're worth a lot of money already, and people are looking for these cards in high grade. Eights, 6, 7, and 8s have all grown, but the 58 8, the 52 8, the 62 8, grew very strongly because there's just not a lot of 8s that exist in these cards. And the percentage, this is where it gets a little wonky, right? You see the 68 6, the 72 in action, and my thought on this is just this: these cards already had a low base. The 68 6, for example, was a $60 to $80 card, at one point that really grew. In fact, I think in 19 it was a $40 card. So, for it to go $40 to $80 to $120, it just shows like, hey, this card was just maybe really undervalued. And if you're a collector, and I'll talk about this quite a bit, you're going to buy what's available. If you really want a maze card, some of these cards like the 68 are available. They're on eBay all the time, so you have a chance to buy that card. And so if more people are looking to buy, the only card they can get is the 68. It's going to go up in value. And I think that's what we saw a little bit with maze cards. Now, in terms of losers, you do see the 7 pop up 3 different times here, and then on the decrease percentage wise, again, pops up 3 times. Now, what I'm looking at here is the 51 Bowman 7 decreased the most, but I'd also position that the 51 Bowman, the 52 Bowman, the 54 Bowman all went up tremendously in value during this time period. And so did the Topps cards. And, in reality, these 50s cards just, went nuts. I talked about that quadrupling in value. And when the great correction started to happen in sports cards, some of these cards had gone way too much in the direction of value, and there was some correction for those cards, right? But what you're seeing here is 3 out of the 5 cards, in terms of percent decrease, and 4 out of the 7 cards I have listed on the decrease per card, because some of them appear more than once, were Bowman. And so Bowman cards were actually targeted as being, more overvalued and decrease more than Topps cards. So I think it's pretty interesting. And also, like the 58 Topps 7, again, I talk about that in between grade. It went up really tremendously in value, then dropped back down because, I think people aren't seeing the value of the 7 like they do some of the other grades. And I'll talk about that a little bit too. But 7s were very much called out in this data. So there's something there with the value of 7s right now. So for all 3 grades, so 6, 7, and 8, there was I think 12, let's see, 3, 6, 9, 10. Yeah, 10 grades, or 10 years of cards, where, or just 10 cards, that did grow in value in all 3 grades. So the 68 Topps, we talked about that, had the highest percent gain in all three grades, followed by 63 tops, 63 flair, 60 tops. So this is very interesting that it's very 60s heavy. And then you see the 72 tops thrown in there. Not a lot of 50s cards, right? And you see three different all-star cards in there because, again, I think people are looking for value and looking for things that are a little underpriced. So when you throw in the pop counts, so the 10 hardest to find PSA 8s, unsurprisingly are in the 50s. You only have one card from the 60s in this top 10, which is the 62 tops. But look at these pop counts. I mean, below 100 for most of them, and the 58 and All-Star and Topps card are barely above 100. So, and it is surprising to me to see that 58 All-Star being such a hard card to find. Because personally, when I was looking at All-Star cards, when I was collecting, well, I mean, still collecting, but when I was buying my Clemente collection and looking at Aaron and Mantle and Mays, those cards just didn't seem to be overly hard to find, and so I just never considered them to be rare. But that 58 All-Star Mays is rare, and it's really blowing up in price. You can see it's gained 127% across all grades. Now, in terms of total dollars, obviously the 53 Tops is a card that's just expensive. But 63 Tops has gone up $583 in average value across all three grades. That's a lot. that is a pretty big swing in price for a card like that. And another card that surprised me was the $274 in the 61 Tops card. Because again, that card never shows up on a rarity list. It's kind of a mediocre to kind of easy to find card. Now, so again, the 53 and the 58 are two cards that do appear on this hardest to find list. But it's only two. And it's just interesting that a lot of the cards that grew in all three grades weren't the hardest to find. Now, if you look at the easiest to find PSA 8s, there's definitely some interesting things here. Look at that 72 Tops. 1,200 8s versus 127 for the 54 Tops, or 45 for the 53. So it's massively more available. Even the 68 Tops has got almost 500 cards available, right? So if you look at this list, the 68 Tops, the 61 Tops, and the 72 Tops are all in the top 10 easiest to find 8s. And the 61 Tops went up a lot in terms of value. So I do think these cards, because they come up for auction so often, they're literally there every week, that people just go like, well, I want a Maze card, and that's available, so I'm going to go buy one, and now I'm going to compete with these other collectors who want to buy a Maze card, and it's really driven the price up quite a bit on those cards, whereas beforehand, people like me would just say, well, that card's pretty easy to get, I'm not going to pay over this amount of money for it. But, with more collectors getting in the hobby saying, look, I got to have a Maze card, you're seeing that effect on these cards. Again, what does this all mean? So, as a summary here, is, there's a lot of data there, right? So, first of all is, overall, investing in Maze cards, no matter what card it is a good idea. So if you bought some Maze cards, even if you bought the 68 or 72, which is some of the highest pop cards, you made money. You did a good job. That was a smart thing to do. And it's still a smart thing to do because they're still growing in value and we're still seeing prices creeping up on some of these cards, every month. And the hard to get ones, I think, are going to go kind of nuclear at some point. At some point, you're going to see some of those really tough 8s just become unattainable, like the 62 Tops. The 58 Tops. They're just going to be a card that's going to just be eventually $10,000, $15,000, $20,000. You're not going to be able to get it unless you got some big bucks to spend. And again, like I said, all Maze cards 6 through 8 grew at 18% year over year. So good return when a lot of modern cards were tanking in value. Maze cards were stable and growing. The market is not rational, and this is why I pointed out a lot in the video so far as it's really odd to see a 58 Tops card and a PSA 7 decreasing in value while something like the 68 Tops is, going up 286%. So The rarity of the card right now is not that important, because if you look at it in contrast to the modern market, all the cards are rare. If you're going to do that comparison, right? So if you look at it just in totality, that 68 Topps card is still pretty rare compared to anything modern, anything in the 90s. So it's just a matter of opinion, or in terms of what you're comparing against. If you're comparing it against other cards from the 50s and 60s, there's definitely some cards from Mays that aren't hard to get. But in general, they're still pretty rare. When you're saying a card of a pop of 500 is easy to get, versus a card of the pop of 45 is really tough. That's a factor of 10. But 500 cards is still pretty rare in the grand scheme of things, if a lot more people want to buy Maze cards, right? So rarity is not the most important factor to price. Again, availability, if the card is actually for sale a lot and people want to buy it, that could drive pricing, right? And design. It's hard to underestimate the reason, some cards are popular. It's just that they're better looking. The 60 Topps card is a better looking card than 61. Period, in my opinion. So I'm going to chase that card harder than I am going to chase that 61. And prices are going to reflect it. Some designs are just better than others. And this goes to Bowman cards. And I really think Bowman cards took a big hit because they're just not popular. And I don't mean to say that people hate them. But when you look at a Topps card versus a Bowman card, the Topps card is starting to outperform, the same card, or say same year, different makers. The Bowman, 54 versus the 54 Topps versus the 54 Bowman, 55 Bowman versus the 55 Topps Maze cards. The Topps cards just, perform so much better. And so it's just, I think the market has spoken that the Topps cards are so much preferred that delta, I think, is going to eventually just become wider and wider. Where the 55 Bowman Maze is a great card. I love it. I really want one. But it's going to continue to be vastly outpaced in all grades by the Topps card, because I still think the Topps card is a better looking card. And it's harder to get, in a lot of ways, in different grades. But it's also in so much more demand. So again, Bowman cards just aren't as popular, and that's just the fact. And again, if you put the numbers to it, the 50s Bowman Maze cards declined by 20% in all three grades, while the Topps cards from the 50s grew 12%. So even though you saw some massive declines, like the 52 Topps 7, I think, declined, the delta is still 32% delta between the value of Topps cards versus Bowman. So that's pretty massive. And that delta is going to continue to widen over the, because that's what the market has said, that's what we want, and that divide is going to continue to get wider. Again, I said it before, but PSA 7s are an in-between grade. And what I mean by in-between is that the 6 is a value card, the 8 is a high-end investor grade, the 7 is a card that doesn't really have a home for someone who's looking for a, let's say, a cheaper alternative, which is the 6, but it's not in high enough condition to be the high-end investment card, so it falls through the cracks. And what happens, I think, with 7s, especially 50s and 67s, is the high-end guys ignore them. The value guys don't want to pay that much, and so there's less collectors really looking for that 7. And sometimes, when the market's hot, somebody will go out and overpay for one, but it's not consistent enough. And then when the market starts to soften a little bit, those cards are the ones that we're seeing with some of these dramatic drops, like the 51 Bowman and the 52 Topps. Those are still great cards. However, they grew so much, but there's just not as many collectors that are wanting those grades as there are some of these other grades. And so they're just being a little bit more selective about what they're buying. and that grade itself seems to be falling through the cracks. So it's going to be interesting to see if that continues to be the case, because that would be a really interesting video about, is the PSA 7 now a undervalued card in grade and vintage? So that might be an interesting thing to look at across other players and other sets. But right now in Maze, it's really looking like a grade that people aren't as interested in collecting, and it's dropped in value a lot more than any other grade that I've looked at. Now, the All-Star cards and in-action cards, which is like one card. But I wanted to look at it because I kept seeing these cards sell for more and more, and so I thought I would just throw them in there. And if you look at year over year, they grew at 36% compared, which is double the average for all other Maze cards. So, man, those cards have kind of taken off, and you saw the 58 is actually pretty rare. But the 61, the 60, the 59 aren't as rare, but they've really, done well in terms of growth. And I think, again, it's people looking for value. It's like why the 6s have grown so strong. It's because people can't afford the 8s anymore. Well, I can't afford a 58 Maze card. I just talked about how that 58 Maze card is going to be a $20,000 card one day. But maybe I can afford a $800 All-Star card. Same year, the design's kind of cool. I can afford that card, but I can't afford the base card, but now I can afford the All-Star card. And I think we're seeing that. We're seeing people looking for alternatives. And I need to look closer at those cards plus combo and league leader cards, because we've seen growth in those two areas as well. So, at the end of the day, Maze cards are strong. They're growing. When I look at Aaron, Clemente, Mantle, and future videos, I'm hoping to see the same thing. But the vintage market is really strong right now, guys. If you're looking to diversify and take a little less risk, this is what I would look at, because, you could just throw a dart on a Maze card right now, and you're pretty much, unless you just pick a weird, a 51 Bowman 7, you were going to make money, right? So very few of these cards are losing money. Majority are going up. And that is a pretty safe place to be right now with a lot of this uncertainty in the hobby in terms of value and what's going to be stable. To me, this is about as stable as you're going to get. And there's a lot more runway here with Maze cards in the future than I think with some other players. So hopefully you enjoyed the video. Leave me comments. Tell me what you want to see me look at next in terms of vintage, or other players you want me to do some analysis on, and I'll do it. And I appreciate you guys. Like and subscribe. I'm trying to grow the channel, hoping to get to 1,000 at some point. But hope you guys like the content, and I'll see you next time on Cards and Comics. Bye.